So what I'd like to talk to you about today is something about our current understanding of the impacts of CO2 emissions on marine life and why this might be relevant to all of us. So it's an often quoted fact that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the oceans. And the oceans pose something of a mystery to our understanding of climate change as well. And I'll be digging into some of those mysteries today. So it seems like almost every day there's a new piece of news about climate change, whether it be increased storm frequency, changes in rainfall levels, forest fires, melting glaciers. All of these impacts relate to the effect of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the so-called greenhouse effect, which increases the amount of energy in the Earth's system and changes Earth's climate. What I'd like to highlight today, though, is another impact of CO2 emissions. It turns out that only about half of all human CO2 emissions actually stays in the atmosphere. About a quarter of that CO2 dissolves into the ocean. This portion of the CO2 budget doesn't cause global warming, but it does change the chemistry of the ocean in two very important ways. Firstly, it lowers the pH of the ocean, making it more acidic, so-called ocean acidification. And it also increases the total amount of carbon in the ocean. And both of these things can affect marine life in quite significant ways. I just show here on this slide the well-known late 20th century record of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that's been taken at the Mauna Loa station in Hawaii, but also a corresponding record of ocean pH that was taken from a nearby oceanographic station in the Pacific, showing a decrease in ocean pH over the last 25 years. So when we look at the response of ocean life to high CO2 conditions, we find many organisms show negative impacts of ocean acidification. On the left of this slide, you can see that 70% of finfish species show negative impacts of ocean acidification. So you move towards the right on this slide, you'll see that other groups of species are more resistant to high CO2 conditions. And highlighted in green on these graphs, there's a minority of species that actually show positive growth responses to high CO2 conditions. In this case, these species are probably resistant to acidification, but can actually make use of the added carbon that's present in the oceans. So you're probably quite familiar with all of these species. They're all quite well known. What I'd like to draw your attention to today, though, is another group of species you may not have heard much about, but I'm hoping to convince you that they're actually pretty important. And these are a group called the coccolithophores. They're a type of single-celled plankton that are notable because they form these rather pretty shells or skeletons surrounding their cells made out of the mineral calcium carbonate. So you're probably thinking that a single-celled plankton sounds a bit less glamorous than coral reef conservation or less important than a $60 billion finfish industry that's threatened by ocean acidification. However, these humble organisms are very important because of the huge numbers in which they grow. These things form, when ocean conditions are right for their growth, they form enormous blooms that are so large you can actually see them from space. Here's an example of one of these blooms off the coast of Northeast America. And here's another bloom off the west coast of France and the UK, so really enormous in scale. Ultimately, the building materials for these cells and these blooms comes from carbon in the upper ocean, including from anthropogenic CO2 from our cars and factories. When these blooms die, the dead cells sink to the bottom of the ocean and they sequester carbon away from the atmosphere for a period of time. So it may surprise you to know that the climate models that we use to predict future climate change don't really contain any information about the biology of organisms such as this at all. And this is a little bit of a scary thought because it represents a significant uncertainty in our ability to predict the future. For example, in this model here, you see predictions of future global temperature change based on two different CO2 emission scenarios. There's nothing about carbon uptake by plankton in the ocean included in those sort of models. If If you're not convinced that plankton dynamics are important, here I show the results of satellite monitoring over a 16-year period in the productive ocean waters surrounding Antarctica. And the areas in blue here show areas where calcium carbonate production has decreased by over 10% in this ocean basin over that 16-year time period. And the total amount of calcium carbonate production in this ocean basin is roughly equivalent to what 7 million cars emit in a year. So a very significant amount. What we don't know, though, is how these populations are going to respond in the next 16 years or the next 100 years, and how that will impact the global carbon cycle and therefore climate. The types of plankton I'm talking about are very notable because they're extremely diverse, which you can see just by looking under the microscope. These are all different species of coccolithophore. And what makes understanding their response to climate change especially challenging, but also interesting, is how this diversity and some of their other characteristics potentially allow them to adapt and evolve to changing climate. In other words, they can potentially change themselves in response to climate change, and what's more, how they do change themselves may feed back into the climate system itself. So here we can see a big difference between different groups of species potentially impacted by climate change. So polar bears are an example of, well, they're something of a poster child, really, for a climate change victim. They have relatively long generation times, they have a small population with a very limited geographic range, limited to the Arctic, and they have very little capacity to respond to a changing climate. These types of plankton I'm talking about, they are a very different story. Their populations are huge, they can grow very quickly, up to 1 or 2 generations per day, and they're very diverse. And they also have a global range. All of these things mean that they have very high potential to be able to adapt and evolve to future climate change. For example, if you had one individual that was well adapted to high CO2 or high temperatures, on the timescales of anthropogenic climate change, that individual has a chance to become a dominant in plankton populations through time. So this is not a conventional conservation problem. These organisms are not endangered, so we're not talking about saving them, but it's about understanding them, because broad-scale changes in their population structure in the far-flung oceans may eventually feed back into climate change impacts we feel back home. If you were to visit my laboratory, you'd find experiments running where we're challenging these plankton with acidity and temperatures that may represent future ocean conditions to try and understand how these creatures may adapt and evolve in the future. And my vision is that we can gain enough insight from these type of experiments to better improve climate models and therefore ultimately make better policy decisions going forwards. So I hope I've convinced you that our future fate under climate change may be linked to the response of these obscure single-celled organisms in far-flung oceans. Thanks for listening.